In the year 1888, I was engaged at Mosul, a town on the right or west bank of the river Tigris, opposite to the ruins of the ancient city of Nineveh, in carrying on excavations for the trustees of the British Museum. In the neighboring mound of Kuyun Jik, and in the performance of my official duties, I was brought into contact with His Excellency the Wali, or Governor of Mosul, and with many of the principal ecclesiastical authorities of the town and of the villages round about. Whenever the opportunity offered, I made inquiries about manuscript copies of ancient Syriac books in which I was interested, and I visited various churches and monasteries where I heard that old Syriac MSS were to be found. In Mosul itself, some private individuals courteously showed me such manuscripts as they had, but the suggestion that I should purchase the same met with firm refusals on the part of their true owners. The further proposition on my part to have copies made at my expense was received with a series of politely given refusals, which all who have dealt with the Mesopotamian Oriental will readily understand. I paid a visit to the Jacobite patriarch in his beautiful house and asked for help, but failed to receive any. The venerable patriarch gave me an account of his journey to England and described at some length his visit to Windsor Castle and the gracious manner in which he had been received and treated by Her Majesty Queen Victoria. And, pointing to some of the furniture in his room, he assured me that he had profited by the example set by the English in providing themselves with comfortable homes. He next commented in English, for he spoke the language fairly well, on the wickedness of those of the faithful who sold their manuscripts, and then assured me that he had neither manuscripts nor money. The visit was interesting, but so far as my own object was concerned, it had no practical result. A few days later, I paid a visit to the vicar of the Nestorian or Chaldean patriarch, who received me cordially and was undoubtedly anxious to assist me by every means in his power. His protestations of friendship soon assumed a practical form, for, having told me that he had a number of valuable Syriac MSS in his house and could obtain access to others, he produced without delay several dusty manuscript volumes. Among those which were brought and placed on the floor before us was a very thick book in a dilapidated condition, which the vicar said he prized highly, as it was the only old copy of it known to him. The size of the book was large, oblong, quarto, about 15 inches by 9 inches, and it was 3 or 4 inches thick, though many of the leaves at the beginning and end were loose. It appeared to be complete, and only after a close examination of it did I find that it was not so. Leaves were missing in several places. 3 or more quires were wanting about 2/3 of the way through the volume, and many leaves were so much damaged in places by damp that words and even whole lines could hardly be read. In spite of such defects, however, there was no doubt in my mind that the manuscript was of considerable importance, especially when I found from the headings of certain sections that it contained the book of the histories of the triumphs of the saints and ascetics of the Egyptian desert, called Paradise, which was composed by Mar Palladius, bishop of the city of Helenopolis, and was addressed to Lausus, the prefect. I was familiar with the Syriac MSS of Palladius in the British Museum, but I had never before seen so lengthy a copy of the Paradise of the Fathers, and it was clear that the volume must contain copies of collections of lives of saints, which some pious man had paid to have copied, for his private benefit, or for the use of the members of a church or monastery. The next point to try and decide was the date of the manuscript. This was no easy matter, for the colophon was missing, and the patriarch's library possessed none of the European paleographical publications which are so essential for making satisfactory comparisons of the text with dated manuscripts. And for the correct assignments of dates, the Paradise of Palladius, which we had before us, was identical in size and shape with another volume there containing a copy of Hudra, i.e., the service book of the Nestorian Church for the whole year, which was compiled by the famous monk Ananisio of the monastery of Beth Abbey in Marga. This volume was in good condition, The pages, though in places stained by water, were clean, and the writing was in the good hand which the late Professor William Wright associated with the 12th century. Now, whether the Book of Paradise and this copy of the Hudra were written at the same time, I cannot say, but the handwriting of the former work appeared to me to be more modern than that of the latter. I told Dom Cuthbert Butler that I thought it was characteristic of the 14th or 15th century, and it may well be so. On the other hand, it may have been a century older. Such ludicrous dates have been assigned to Syriac and Ethiopic MSS during the last 30 years that it seemed to me better to err on the side of underdating than overdating, and in so doing I followed the example of my great master William Wright. Now, although the age of the Book of Paradise, which the vicar of the Chaldean Patriarch showed me in 1888 puzzled me as much then as it does now, it seemed to be necessary to obtain as good a copy of it as possible. And I opened negotiations with this object in view. For as the volume before me was the property of the church, it was hopeless to attempt to purchase it. The vicar promised to allow a careful scribe to have access to the book, and to supervise the general accuracy of the transcript of it which was to be made. Mr. Nimrod Rassam purchased the paper and had it prepared for writing upon, and the work of copying was begun. The copy was finished in the month of the latter Teshrin, and I brought it to England in April 1891. On my return to this country, I examined this copy of the Book of Paradise carefully in connection with the MSS of Palladius in the British Museum, and it seemed to me quite certain that it represented the recension of the work of Palladius, which was made by Anan Isho, a monk of Beth Abbey, in the latter half of the 7th century of our era. An account of the making of this recension is, fortunately, preserved to us in the Historia Monastica, written by Thomas, Bishop of Marga, about AD 1840. According to this writer, Anan Isho, who was a native of Adiabene, studied at Nisibis and then entered the great monastery of Isla, where he devoted himself to literary work. He lived a life of the sternest asceticism, and, having his mind constantly fixed upon the works of the ascetic fathers, determined to go and worship in Jerusalem. And from there he went to the desert of Set, where he learned concerning all the manner of the lives of the ascetic fathers, whose histories and questions are written in books, and concerning their dwellings and the places in which they lived. When Thomas came back from Set, he did not settle down in Isla, but went on to Beth Abbey in Marga, where his literary reputation became so great that Isho Yab, the metropolitan of Arbela, asked him to assist him in drawing up the canons. Subsequently, when Isho Yab became patriarch, he begged Ananisho to arrange the Book of the Fathers, that is to say, the histories of the ascetics of the deserts and mountains of Egypt, which had been compiled by Palladius and Jerome, and at length he agreed to do so. We need not now consider the details of the arrangement of Ananisho's work, and it is sufficient here to mention that Thomas tells us it was arranged in 2 volumes. In the first part were the histories of the Holy Fathers, composed by Palladius and Jerome, and in the second part were the questions and the narratives of the Fathers, which he himself had brought together. Such a work could not have been entrusted to better hands, for Ananisho possessed not only the literary skill necessary for carrying out successfully such a great undertaking, but having visited Jerusalem and the Set desert and seen the actual places where the desert saints had lived, and having obtained his knowledge at first hand, he was able to impart to his recension of the Book of the Fathers an accuracy and vividness which, without his local knowledge, would have been absolutely impossible. It is not so stated by Thomas of Marga, but we are bound to assume that a Syriac scholar, with the energy and ability and knowledge of Anan Isho, would search for and bring back with him the best and fullest copies he could find of the works of Palladius and Jerome, and transcripts of other works of the same kind. There is no room for doubting that he collected his materials both wisely and skillfully, and for this reason his recension of the Book of Paradise is of the greatest value. From the copy of Ananísio's recension, which I had obtained, I published several extracts in my edition of the Historia Monastica of Thomas Marga, and gave a full description of it on pages 192 through 206 of the same work. Soon after the appearance of the Historia Monastica, in the autumn of 1893, I began to translate Ananísio's recension of the Book of Paradise, and whilst thus occupied, I caused many enquiries to be made by my friends at Mosul and in the neighborhood, with the view of finding other copies of Ananísio's work, from which the lacuna in the text might be filled up. All such enquiries were fruitless, I regret to say. In 1894, as I learned that Dom Cuthbert Butler was devoting himself to the study of the Book of Paradise in all its versions, and that he was, like Dr. Erwin Proshin, engaged in the preparation of a work on the subject, and in a minute investigation into the history of the transmission of the versions, I willingly placed my copy of Ananísio's recension at his disposal, and as a testimony to the value of the manuscript, I quote his words. He says, "If it is possible to make here a more careful study than has hitherto been made of the Losiac history in Syriac, and to clear up some confusions and misconceptions, this will be mainly due to the kindness of Dr. Budge, who placed at my disposal his fine codex of the Paradise of Ananísio, described in his edition of Thomas of Marga's Book of the Governors." He then goes on to compare its contents with those of the only other ancient copy in Europe, which is preserved in the library of the Vatican. Codex Syriacus, CXXVI, and discusses its relative value at considerable length. He decided that Ananísio made use of an ancient Syriac version, which Dom Butler calls number 1, and that he filled up the gaps which existed in the copies of it current in his time from a manuscript of Syriac version number 2, which was contemporaneous with number 1. This being so, the recension of Ananísio will help us to reconstruct in its main features the Syriac version of the Losiac history, as it existed in the early part of the 6th, if not the 5th century. In 1896, I received an application for the loan of my copy of Ananísio's recension from Père Bejan, who was said to be preparing an edition of the Syriac text of the Book of Paradise, but I did not see my way to lend it because I was translating it into English and preparing an edition of the text myself. Further, there seemed to me to be need for an English translation of the Syriac text of the work attributed to Palladius. It is hard not to think that, had Père Bejan known of the existence of a copy of Ananísio's recension of the works of Palladius and Jerome before the publication of my description of it in the Historia Monastica, he would naturally have made an edition of it for the first volume of his Acta Sanctorum, instead of reprinting a number of texts which had been published by Cureton and other scholars. Père Bejan's edition appeared in 1897, but an examination of it convinced me that there was still room for a publication of the text of Ananísio's recension, and I continued my work of copying and translating. That year, however, my official duties took me to the Sudan, and I was excavating there for several months. On my return to England early in 1898, I had to undergo an operation on one eye for glaucoma, and I was forbidden by the oculist to work more than was absolutely necessary at Oriental languages for some time. The prohibition was imperative, and I reluctantly abandoned my work on the Book of Paradise and begged Lady Mieux of Theobald's Park, whose interest in all that appertains to early Egyptian and Ethiopian Christianity is well known, to accept my Codex of Ananísio's recension and to let it form a part of her collection of Oriental MSS. Subsequently, Lady Mieux began to make enquiries concerning the contents of the Book of Paradise, and we had several conversations on the subject, and finding that no complete translation of the Book of Paradise existed in any modern language, she, with characteristic generosity, offered to defray the cost of printing the entire Syriac text, provided that it was accompanied by a full English translation and a brief account of the origin of the Syriac version and of the growth of Christian asceticism in Egypt. Everyone knows that the true home of Christian asceticism and monasticism was Egypt, and that the monks and recluses and anchorites of Syria and Mesopotamia only imitated the stern lives of their predecessors in the desert of Set, in the western delta, and in the mountains of the Thebaid in Upper Egypt. And in the mountains of the Thebaid in Upper Egypt. And everyone knows that the oldest, fullest, and truest account of the holy ascetics of Egypt was written by Palladius. This distinguished man was no mere compiler of the lives of saints from histories written by other men, but he possessed a personal knowledge of the Egyptian monks and their lives, which is unique. At the age of 20, he embraced the monastic life, and going to Alexandria in 388, he studied for 3 years under the direction of the strictest ascetics of the day. He next lived with monks in the Nitrian desert for a year, and about 391 he retired into the inner desert and took up his abode in the very center of the monastic life in a place called the cells. Here he lived for 9 years. And here he met and conversed with the greatest ascetics of his day, and became acquainted with solitary monks of every class. In 404 or 405 he went to Rome, and during his stay there he visited the monks who lived near the city and in Campania. At a later period he was banished to Sienne, the modern Aswan, and still later to the Thebaid, where, however, he turned his time to good account by living among the monks in Antinopolis. Subsequently, he went to Palestine and lived for some time among the monks on the Mount of Olives. In 420, he wrote his famous Book of Paradise, which he dedicated to Lausus, a chamberlain at the court of Theodosius II, and which in consequence is generally known as the Historia Lausiaca, or Lausiac history. In this work he records the lives of the ascetics whom he had known personally, or of whom he had gained knowledge from their disciples, and his narratives are written with a minuteness of detail, which makes it clear to every unprejudiced reader that he actually saw and talked with the greater number of the men whom he mentions, and that he visited the places which he describes. On the other hand, as Dom Cuthbert Butler points out, Dr. Weingarten regards the Book of Paradise and the history of the monks as mere fairy tales, which deserve no more credit than Gulliver's Travels. And Dr. Lucius considers Palladius to be a monkish falsifier of history, and his book an uncritical patchwork put together from several different sources. The latter writer thinks, moreover, that Palladius was never a bishop, and that the experiences which he relates are those of other people, and believes that he never was in Egypt. These opinions, however, even though they be those of eminent scholars, have, in my opinion, but little value of Egypt, for the men who formulated them know nothing of Egypt. Against them must be placed the evidence of a scholar like Amélineux, who is not only an expert in Coptic, but is one who, as he himself has told me, has lived in the monasteries of Egypt of the present day, and knows the manners and customs of ascetics, both ancient and modern. This authority believes that Palladius is worthy of credit when he relates what was seen, or heard, or done by himself, and that it is only his hearsay evidence which must be received with caution. In the course of my official work during the last 17 years, I myself have visited many of the larger monasteries in and about Mosul and Mardan and Al-Kosh, and most of the sites of ancient monasteries on the Nile between Khartoum and the sea, and I am of opinion that the local coloring and details of the Nile and Egypt generally, as given by Palladius, are accurate. In Mesopotamia, I have been taken to see men who were in the habit of fasting for 5 days or a week at a time, who watched and prayed all night, who saw visions, and who were in every way emulating the labors of Anthony the Great and his predecessor, Paul of Egypt. Whether Palladius is held by a handful of professors to be a deceiver or not matters, after all, very little, for the fact remains that his work has been received as genuine by Christian ascetics all over Egypt, Ethiopia, Syria, and Mesopotamia, and the lives and deeds of the saints recorded by him have been imitated by a countless number of monks for a period of 14 or 1500 years. The influence of his Book of Paradise in the Christian East has been incalculably great, and there is good reason for believing that it will emerge triumphant from all the honest criticism, from all the honest criticism that may be made upon it.